Our nation has lost its greatest son. Our people have lost a father.
Bidding farewell to Mandela as the world mourns South Africa's anti-apartheid icon, we ask, what does the future hold for the Rainbow Nation without him? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Stephen Cole. He was one of the greatest statesmen of the 20th century, a hero and an inspiration to millions in South Africa and many more millions around the world. But now the long walk is over for Nelson Mandela, or Madiba as he was known at home. The towering figure of South Africa's anti-apartheid movement has died. He was 95. He meant many things to many people, but it was his essential and core messages of forgiveness, reconciliation and tolerance in the most challenging of circumstances that resonated the most with peoples across the world. What then is his legacy in his home country of South Africa? And as South Africans reflect, what progress has the country made since apartheid ended 20 years ago? We'll be talking about that in a moment. But first, Tanya Page has this report from Johannesburg.
Our nation has lost its greatest son.
It was the news South Africans had been dreading. President Jacob Zuma made the announcement just before midnight.
Fellow South Africans, our beloved Nelson Mandela, the founding president of our democratic nation, has departed. He passed on peacefully in the company of his family around 2050 on the 5th of December 2013.
Yet even in death, Nelson Mandela was uniting his people. Young and old, people of all colours, ages and backgrounds gathered outside his home and in Soweto to express their gratitude to a man who gave them everything he had, not through tears, but in song. For those who knew him personally, he was an inspiration to work with.
Well, we had a very good working relationship. Madiba he was a strict employer, but strict in the sense of much more strict on himself. He was always punctual. He had great ideas about meeting people, and his biggest effort every day was that he needed to meet the people of South Africa and talk to them about the future and where we needed to go as a nation.
On the street in Soweto where Nelson Mandela lived during apartheid, people gathered too. This was a hotbed of activism against the racist regime. It held a special place in the iconic leader's heart. The realisation of the people's loss is sinking in.
His selfless service, his defiance in terms of things that he believed should be done.
Mandela is great. No two ways about it. He's the Moses of our time.
Tributes honouring Mandela fill the newspapers. It's a day everyone's been prepared for, but it's still hard. This will be a day of song, celebration and reflection for South Africans on their personal memories of Mandela, their gratitude towards him and their hopes for the future, a future they must now face without the man considered this country's moral compass. Nelson Mandela inspired millions of people to reconcile and forgive. In the coming days, they will honour his memory and legacy as they begin to prepare to say goodbye.
Mandela's legacy is, of course, tied to that of South Africa's ruling party, the ANC, the African National Congress. Mandela was the first commander of the ANC's armed wing, the so-called Spear of the Nation, in the 1960s. He was also involved in guerrilla attacks against apartheid government targets. Decades later, Mandela led the ANC to win South Africa's first democratic elections, and he became the country's first black president. He stepped down after just one term in 1999. But the ANC continued to be South Africa's most dominant political force, and it's won more than 60% of the national parliamentary vote in every election since 1994. In recent years, the party has faced increasing criticism for corruption, cronyism and infighting. Some accuse the ANC of exploiting the memory of apartheid to position the party as the only true champion of South Africa's black majority. Despite all its problems, the ANC is all but assured of winning the forthcoming elections in 2014. So let's bring in our guests. In Johannesburg, Ebrahim Fakir from the Electoral Institute for the Sustainability of Democracy in Africa. Also in Johannesburg, Allister Sparks, a veteran political analyst, historian and author of several books on South Africa. In London, Andrew Feinstein, a former African National Congress member and author of After the Party, Corruption, the ANC and South Africa's Uncertain Future. But let's cross to Johannesburg first and to a country in mourning. How, Mr. Fakir, would you describe the man, the leader, the icon that South Africa has lost?
It's obviously very difficult to encapsulate all of the things that surround the mythology of Nelson Mandela, but in my own view, I think I view him as a radical, a revolutionary, a reconciler, a redistributor, and somewhat even a little bit of a rascal with the naughty twinkle in his eye. And I think that's the most cherished memory that South Africans are going to have of him, especially black South Africans, particularly when one thinks about the redistributionary impulse that it brought with him, the idea of liberty, freedom and equality. And I think those are probably 7 or 8 words which encapsulate the entire mythology around the man.
Allister Sparks, Nelson Mandela was one of the most remarkable leaders and statesmen with a force of personality that I think elevated him above any head of government since the Second World War. How do you remember him?
Well, let me say right away that I think the world is a lesser place today. That now that Nelson Mandela has died, I've been a journalist covering this country for 62 years and traveled the world a lot in that time. I know of no other leader whose mourning is being so universally acknowledged and mourned, and the tributes are flooding in. I don't know of another leader ever who has been mourned on a global basis to this extent.
And I think most people would agree with you there, Allister. In London, Andrew Feinstein, a former member of the ANC, was part of Mr. Mandela's genius. I suppose his genius, the ability back in the 1950s to pull the ANC together. After all, the nationalists wanted black primacy, the communists wanted the end of capitalism, but he navigated all of that, didn't he?
Oh, absolutely. He was, amongst many other things, some of which have been mentioned already, he was a consummate political strategist and political operator. And the ANC has always been a very large and very disparate church. And the skill with which he kept the organization together during the transition and in the first years of democracy was quite remarkable, and I think made even more remarkable by the difficulties that both his successors have had in retaining the unity of the party.
Incredible, Ebrahim Fakir, that he reached the point of the supreme diplomat after almost no training for that kind of role, and also after his years as a guerrilla, the commander-in-chief of the ANC's armed wing, the Spear of the Nation. That's quite a leap.
Well, no doubt, but some people might quip that he had 27 years in which to think about this and craft and hone his strategy, which of course executed with wonderful and superb aplomb. But the reality of the situation is that when Mandela had come into the presidency of the country, literally what faced him was both a social construction project and a state reconstruction project, because at the time what he had found and what he had bequeathed by 300 years of colonialism and 48 years of apartheid was a fragmented state, was a divided society, was an economy in a shambles, and literally in a matter of 3 or 4 years years, he'd begun to turn all of this around. Massively, a state reconstruction program integrating the different homelands and Bantustans which were created by apartheid, bringing the different races together, no doubt, and of course then having to reverse the ill effects of an apartheid economy in decline, which was in fact in stagflation, very high inflation rates, very high interest rates, and a negative economic growth, which was turned around in about 3 or 4 years to represent 4.5% GDP growth, to look at foreign direct investment, which was around 3% of the GDP at the time, and so literally remarkable strides at the time.
Incredible.
But at the same time, asserting his own independence.
Indeed.
And asserting his independence on a global scale.
He had certainly a global following. Allister Sparks, he was jailed for 27 years, 17 years at Robben Island. When he came out, after so long in enforced obscurity, it is incredible that he could exercise so much influence. So that must be down to an incredibly strong personality. Was that the case?
Yes, I think there's no doubt he had a strong personality. I also think he used his years in prison to reflect, and he thought very profoundly. I think he had 3 qualities. I mean, he had many qualities, but 3 in particular, which made him exceptional. One was a deep capacity for empathy with all of humanity, other groups, including his enemies. A second was that he understood power. He understood power that was tangible and power that was less tangible simply because of the image that he'd built up in the world. And thirdly, I think he also knew his weaknesses, what he could not do. And one of the features that struck me, particularly in the early years as he emerged from prison, was his ability to relate to the minority group here, the white group, particularly the Afrikaner people, who'd been oppressing his people for 3 centuries. And he had contemplated this. He'd read up their history. He had required in the prison library for books and even poetry to be sent there so that he could study them. He engaged his own prisoners or prison warders, the people who were jailing him, and got to know about their individual lives. And he came to the conclusion that their anger, their cruelty, emanated from fear of being outnumbered, and that as a nation they would be obliterated if ever there was majority rule. He came to the conclusion that if ever he was to negotiate, and he believed, although he had set up the military option himself, as time went by in prison, he realized that this would have to end at the negotiating table, and
Indeed.
that if ever he was to cut a deal with these people, he would have to understand them.
Exactly,
and neutralize those fears.
Well,
and that, I think, was an amazing capacity and a combination of talents.
It certainly was. 20 years after the fall of apartheid, South Africa has not perhaps fully realised that vision of a country where Nelson Mandela hoped everyone would be equal. Today, it's not race which is the biggest hurdle to equality. A recent survey by the South African Reconciliation Barometer found that class is seen as the most divisive social issue, while race has dropped to 4th on a list where disease and political parties are seen as the 2nd and 3rd most divisive things. And when asked about their perceptions of progress since democracy, the gap between rich and poor was seen as one of the few things South Africa's felt had got worse. Well, Mandela's fellow Nobel laureate was quick to play down fears of tension in South Africa. He said this: "To suggest that South Africa might go up in flames, as some have predicted, is to discredit South Africans and Madiba's legacy." He went on to say, "The sun will rise tomorrow and the next day and the next. May not appear as bright as yesterday, but life will carry on." Andrew Feinstein, a political prisoner who became a free man, a freedom fighter who achieved reconciliation, and a resident who fought for equality. Was his job done when he died?
Very difficult to answer. I think certainly parts of the job were done. He steered the country through a very difficult transition in a relatively peaceful manner, which was an extraordinary achievement. The reintegration, as has been mentioned, of the homelands. You know, the country at the time that we became a democracy, had 17 separate education departments. And I think on what was really the touchstone of his presidency and his worldview, the area of reconciliation, I think the most remarkable progress has been made in South Africa. As you mentioned, I think that huge socioeconomic challenges remain. The levels of inequality, which has actually widened in the 20 years since the demise of apartheid, is an extraordinarily important destabilizing factor in the society, and it undermines the quest not just for equality, but obviously for justice as well. So there are very many dimensions on which the challenges remain. But the South Africa today, which does face huge challenges, corruption being one of them, obviously violent crime remains a problem. But the South Africa of today, despite those challenges, is so profoundly and fundamentally a better place than it ever could be under apartheid, that one has to say on aggregate that his life's work has largely been achieved.
Ebrahim Fakir, outside observers try to separate Mr. Mandela's past from South Africa's present. If things have fallen apart, the argument goes, it's only because of his political party, the ANC, failed to follow him perhaps to the promised land, Ebrahim.
Well, I think it's a bit hasty to make that conclusion, and of course some people will want to hold that view, but in my own view, I think it's very difficult to separate Mandela from his party, and I'm not convinced myself that the party has in all instances deviated from his vision. So if we think about the high levels of corruption, at least at the upper reaches of the state, which is controlled, there's some degree of optimism which has gone, but if one looks at both periods of South African history in the immediate past, if you think about the World Cup and the period in which South Africa hosted the World Cup, there was literally a great outpouring of optimism.
Well, the World Cup is a completely separate issue. The World Cup was the most magnificent picture story and the most fantastic example of reconciliation that I think the world has ever seen and done in a sports arena. But what I'm talking about after Mandela, two of his friends, if you like, who led South Africa, who lead South Africa, have led it to 30% unemployment, high levels of HIV, AIDS, and nothing is working at the moment, is it?
Well, there's no doubt that there's certainly monumental problems, and I don't think anyone would fundamentally disagree with that view. Of course, you simply need to look at the statistics and the data. Literally about 5 or 6 social protests and direct actions happen in communities around the country every month. So I think the indicators are quite clear. The social problems seem almost intractable. But no doubt, if you look closely at the last 12 hours, there's been a certain resurgence of hope. There's been a certain resurgence of optimism, which accompanies the sadness and the disappointment at Mandela's passing, of course, no doubt. But I think South Africans will take this moment to reflect on how to go apart into the future. Now, whether the ANC is in fact following Mandela's path or not is a difficult question to answer, simply because, depending who you ask, some would say, no doubt the ANC is trying to radicalize itself much more than it currently is, and that in part explains many of the tensions which might exist in the ANC. Where one can easily concede is certainly there are not as high levels of integrity in public leadership as they might have been under Mandela's watch and under his generation. So certainly that is a concession I think anyone would be very easily, happily to make.
And Allister Sparks, would another Nelson Mandela, if that's possible, unlikely, certainly cure South Africa of all its ills, do you think? That must be at the heart of Mr. Mandela's legacy.
What I think South Africa is attempting to do, I don't believe has ever been done anywhere else at any time, and that is to merge two nationalisms, two racial nationalisms, into a single nation, which Arnold Toynbee, the great world historian, contended was not possible. and so did the great liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill. We are attempting it. I don't know where else it has been attempted. If you look at the Middle East, at the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis, it seems a very long way from being achieved. Northern Ireland, perhaps a little better, but they were not all that different as people. You look at the Greeks and the Turks in Cyprus. You look at the disintegration of the Soviet Union back into nationalism. You look at Yugoslavia. Indeed. Likewise.
So many examples.
And you look at Germany.
Yeah.
Two people who are the same in history, language, culture, everything. Look how long it took them and how difficult they found it to weld together. Without Mandela, we would not have got anywhere with this. We would have ended in a race war.
Andrew Feinstein, Mr. Mandela was proof, I think, that the hope and activism working together can change history for the better. But now people are talking about his legacy. What is his legacy?
His legacy can be understood in myriad dimensions. Most obvious, his primary legacy is to have charted a path through what could have been a far more bloody and a far more difficult transition. Second, I would suggest, would be the fact that there is, in my opinion, a united South African identity. There are problems, and some of those problems are quite fundamental. But we see over and over again, and yes, usually it is occasions like we have seen since the announcement of Mandela's passing last night, or more joyous occasions like the hosting of the World Cup, various other sporting events, where we see South Africa come together, and suddenly the differences and the problems seem slightly less intractable. And the nation has an extraordinary resilience. And I think this is Mandela's greatest legacy, that he has, as Allister said, out of a potentially bloody race war, he has created a nation that is largely divided. The next step of the challenge is to ensure that those who currently have not benefited economically and socially from the transition start to do so. And that is an extremely difficult challenge.
Ebrahim Fakir, that is an extremely articulate challenge for South Africa. Are the current leaders of South Africa up to Mr. Mandela's legacy? Are they up to solving those?
I don't think anyone is going to be able to fill his shoes, and I don't think anyone is going to be able to do and achieve the kind of remarkable achievements that he's made. But there's no doubt, I think there's a commitment in all parts of South African society to want to achieve some of the outcomes, at least reduce the levels of inequality, try and deal with the intractable social problems of high levels of violence, very high levels of crime, and certainly to kind of usher in a greater developmental impetus into the state. Now, of course, these challenges are not down simply to a political party. I think the ANC, of course, has its own tremendous weaknesses, and particularly we've seen these weaknesses creep in over the last 5 or 6 years. There's no doubt one can say that the ANC is a fundamentally weaker organization. It's much more fractured. Unfortunately, the political plurality which Mandela was able to hold together, even within the national executive of the ANC, is no longer the case. The ANC's national executive is much more homogenous. And so in that view, the internal oversight and accountability mechanisms and the curbs on excessive use of power from within the party have been declining over the last little while.
So they're declining.
And so the commitment on part of society to address these problems is much higher. Absolutely.
Thank you for that. Indeed, thank you to all my guests, Ebrahim Fakir, Allister Sparks and Andrew Feinstein. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to, send us your feedback by email to insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks again for watching. From me, Stephen Cole. Goodbye for now.
Nelson Mandela, never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another. and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. Let freedom reign. God bless Africa. I thank you.